The Metal Gear series is one that has achieved critical immunity. Hideo Kojima is a man who has mastered the art of sticking one's cranium up their own ass. Every single game that this man produced is layered with a thick and viscous amount of subtext, allegories, euphemisms, symbolism, and horniness. He has harnessed the raw, unfiltered ability to make everyone believe that everything he breathes is much deeper than it actually is, and thus every flaw that one could surmise about any of his games are actually intentional, because he is just that much of an alleged visionary. What this means is that any discourse about the games he creates always ends up involving verbiage and superlatives that can be surmised as everything was done with intent, positive and negative, and thus there can be no criticism laid upon any of the games. Since there is no room for criticism, professional haters and so-called Ultimate Metal Gear fans will thus lay any possible hatred or criticism of the series firmly at the feet of the one major game not entirely made by Kojima, instead made by a bunch of white boys. Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes was released for the GameCube in 2004 and developed by the Canadian studio Silicon Knights. As one could likely already tell with their own eyeballs, The Twin Snakes is a remake of the original Metal Gear Solid of 1998, which was on the PlayStation 1. The Twin Snakes added many other features and changes, which most, if not all, cause indescribable hatred from the community. To properly explain why there is a very noticeable hate boner for the changes, one must first understand how the original Metal Gear Solid functioned. I'm not even going to bother to explain the plot because I'm bound to get it wrong and piss someone off, but in an incredible high-level summary, the player assumes the role of a Spec Ops soldier, Solid Snake, as he infiltrates a base of comic book-style terrorists threatening to launch a nuke from a giant walking mech, the Metal Gear. Gameplay has the camera fixed above the player, positioned in an inconvenient manner. One can look at a first-person view to get better visibility within any given environment, but one's actions are severely limited. The game was initially balanced around this camera system. Boss fights and enemy encounters were created to have more or less the idea that players would be wrangling with a camera that would always seem to be keeping opponents just out of one's periphery. Of course, developers at the time had to work with the lowest common denominator of game controller, so the normal, poor person PS1 controller is what the game had to be controlled by for the bare minimum. DualShock was an option the majority did not have, only for the most bougie. Of course, most action games at the time had poor controls due to that same scenario, so considerable praise was also laid out upon the game's cinematic narrative and gameplay diversity, aka different approaches to any given scenario presented. A well-regarded game, often considered one of the greatest of all time. Well, when Metal Gear Solid 2, the sequel, came out, it not only had an even more convoluted and incomprehensible story, but it was on the best controller ever made, the PlayStation 2 controller, with many more buttons available. First-person shooting. Thus, when the Twin Snakes was crafted, it was designed to mimic the newfangled controls of the newer game, but on the goofy GameCube controller. First-person shooting is now in the game. Climbing over rails is also included. Where before, shooting a gun could only be on one plane of action, now one could shoot at elevated or depressed locations with ease. Don't want to go the long way around? Well, just drop down and take a hit of health to avoid breaking cover. Where any gun shooting scenario in the original was previously very stressful and somewhat annoying because it was difficult to tell where one was aiming beyond the field of view, unless Solid Snake had auto-locked onto the opponent. Now, one can make precision shots, in effect, a much more comfortable way to land shots. One now knows what they are shooting at. The issue with the first-person aiming, or at least the issue that people take issue with, is that the game geometry and environment was not considerably changed to reflect this new dimension of aiming, a concern of which, I believe, is greatly exaggerated. First-person aiming does allow one to take longer shots easier than in the original game, meaning one does not have to get as close to the enemy soldier as they may have before. However, To claim that the game was not balanced in any way to compensate is rather false. According to a contemporary GameSpot review, the enemy soldiers have more complex artificial intelligence to compensate for the enhanced shooting range that Solid Snake has in this new game. Some soldiers report their position regularly, so taking them out would make their said report be late, causing more guards to arrive for a check-in. An enemy soldier dispatched does not have their body immediately disappear, which happened in the original, meaning any other enemies or soldiers in the area can see them and raise an alarm. Other contemporary reviews of the game also relayed similar sentiments. The enemy AI gives the player a tougher time than in the original, and I must say I concur. It is now possible to make a very long-range shot with a handgun, but the punishment for missing is now more severe. Many small changes to impact the balance of the game, or maybe just make it closer to Metal Gear Solid 2. Of course, the first-person shooting element did allegedly have a considerably more negative impact on one portion of the game, that being the boss fight with Revolver Ocelot. In the original game, the boss fight with Revolver Ocelot takes place in a square room, where the titular enemy stands behind a pillar and takes pot shots at Snake. Only issue is that the aiming system is ass. So one just points and guesses where Revolver may be, and hopes that he may be hit on with the auto lock-on. Snake may also just run around the room to get a better view of him, so the entire fight is just a rather mundane and unpleasant version of gun tag. Not fun. In Twin Snakes, the first-person aiming turns this boss fight into a somewhat trivial first-person cover shooter event. Now that Ocelot is basically perpetually visible, a bead can always be made on his head. Not to say it is a cakewalk, he will still mow the player down if one stands in the open too long, thus forcing Snake to change positions and reload. On normal difficulty, maybe one can tank or sponge these hits and defeat him, sure, but nothing is ever guaranteed when laziness is applied to everyday actions. Now, people who have made their whole personality focused on the Church of Kojima will have one believe that this change ruins the whole game, because the very first boss fight in the game is now easier in a negative way. The full Metal Gear experience is not being achieved, is what is being said. Fans of Metal Gear will often say that Kojima has some abstract emotion or mood that must be met emotionally with every boss fight, that is thus carried throughout the entirety of the game afterwards. So, in the original, they may say that the first fight being really boring is intentional. Not saying I disagree with that assessment of mood and circumstance in a game, but what is often forgotten is that while the game was developed by a bunch of white boys in the highly unfortunate country of Canada, Kojima was also highly involved in development, and by that I mean he was the producer of the game. Even so, should Kojima have actually made a mistake allowing for there to be first-person shooting, especially with the Revolver Ocelot fight, I don't think the fundamental enjoyment of the game is ruined. The 5-minute boss fight being easier against Ocelot does not diminish the quality of his on-screen presence throughout the rest of the game, meaning he is still a cool villain. The single-action army is not that good, though. Not to mention that, in my subjectively objective opinion, that all the other boss fights in this game are virtually unaltered in their difficulty by the addition of the first-person aiming. And trust me, I tried to break all of them with the first-person aiming. I only came close with the Vulcan Raven fight, but I still found dropping claymores in the arena to be a much more efficient and fun method. In the litany and myriad of other bullshit complaints that so-called internet intellectuals like to argue with against the game, it would be the cutscenes. The said cutscenes were directed by Ryuhei Kitamura, who made movies that I have never watched and never will watch, but it is said to me by Wikipedia that he likes bullet time and slow-mo in his movies, and thus bullet time Matrix-esque action scenes were added into the game. Of course, he did not do this willingly. He initially tried to mirror the cutscenes that were contained in the original game, but Kojima said no. So thus, the cutscenes are textbook definitions of balls-to-the-wall early 2000s action film. Sticks in the mud and those who lack self-reflection will see Solid Snake kickflip off a missile and then bitch, but will otherwise cream their pants seeing Raiden fling his twink-ass fighting the geckos, intently watch Quiet snipe a fighter jet pilot midair, and be otherwise completely elated playing all of Metal Gear Rising. Maybe the perspective on the extravagant cutscenes was viewed differently in 2003 or 4 or whatever, when the only other game for comparison was Metal Gear Solid 2, which, while not lacking in unusual or high concept aspects in the slightest, doesn't really compare to what would be in store later on. That being said, we are here in later on. There was a whole series of Metal Gear games with a broad mix of sincere character moments and fucking sick combat cutscenes. One cannot complain anymore in a sincere manner. These cutscenes are fucking awesome, and would later be made the primary vibe of the series as a whole. What's more, only the action scenes have bullet time, and the other such hype and aura moments. Character and plot development scenes are virtually one-to-one the same, if not better shot, than before, but the character's lips move, which I find to be more compelling. At this stage, one can already tell I am in favor of the game. After one gets over the barrier of the first-person shooting and cutscene disagreements, everything else that one could feasibly cause controversy with the game is either mute, a cop-out, or highly subject to subjective opinion. Some say the dialogue and voice acting is worse. To that, I say, how can you even tell? It is the same actors, saying the same lines, and effectively the same cadence as before. Human emotion is the most subjective thing one can experience, and while all of my emotions are fortunately highly objective and backed by scientists I made up, I cannot recall any particular moment of dialogue that made me cringe or recoil in disgust. It is the dialogue of Metal Gear Solid 1, re-recorded. It's fine. Maybe playing back-to-back the original to the new one can favor the original, since that is the first, and the human mind often regards those who came first with more reverence. But I played the PlayStation 1 version first, and I still came to this conclusion. When I played Metal Gear Solid 1 for the first time, it was on my PS3 just before the great coof pandemic of 2021. I was 20 years old. Metal Gear Solid, the original, came out a few months before I was born, and I spent the majority of my younger years just playing racing games. So I had no nostalgia going into it, just curiosity surrounding its everlasting hype. What I was met with is a once groundbreaking stealth action game that was exceptionally annoying for me to play. After playing in life nothing but said racing games and then a litany of other first and third person games in my teens, the game felt rather archaic to interact with. In a humbling manner, though. I saw the vision. I saw what Wikipedia and samey-sounding YouTubers meant when the term "the best" was used, reading in between the lines. Good enough to continue to play the other games in the series. The third game is the only one to ever make me cry, but I, did not have any desire to play the first one again. Returning to the game now, instead as the slightly newer Twin Snakes, I came to the conclusion that I do so enjoyed playing this one better. The cutscenes, a cornerstone to the title, being one of the first games to have the movie-like scenes, are simply better because one can see animated faces and fingers. I like seeing people's faces. A good example, at least, really stood out to me, is how one can really see Sniper Wolf's disgust in her face when all the male characters are acting pervy to her in this one scene. Something that cannot be properly communicated in the original without verbal explanation. Not that verbal explanation would ever be reduced in the series when the faces could be seen. Hour-and-a-half long cutscene in the fourth one. People like seeing people. It is easier to appreciate the emotions a person is going through when seeing a face and lips and eyes, not just a head that bobs for several minutes with exaggerated Italian hand motions. If one grew up with these type of character models in games, I get it. You want everyone to appreciate what you appreciated. And in many games, maybe it is for the best that a new player sees how games used to be made to better appreciate where they are now. A humbling experience, so to say. The original was punching above its weight, but the Twin Snakes allows these cutscenes to be animated in the manner they deserved to be in. If I were to recommend someone to the Metal Gear series, though, I often wonder which one should be recommended. Maybe the better answer is to first gauge one's interest in video games in general. Should they be hardcore and spend considerably more hours watching YouTube essays on games instead of playing games, the original may be better. since they have likely already watched multiple essays on the Metal Gear series and thus already know how to play it, or have been otherwise indoctrinated into the cult of playing dumb old games for fun, like me, the head propagandist of this movement. Should this theoretical individual be more casual though, maybe enjoy playing 1 or 2 games per month, I would recommend the Twin Snakes. One could hype the original game to high heaven and say it's the greatest of all time, but the concessions made for it to even exist on the PlayStation 1 may be highly unappetizing to people who normally play with whatever is newest. They would probably think one is pulling their leg on it being the greatest of all time within the first 5 minutes of them trying to open a menu, or comprehending the Psycho Mantis fight without a guide. This is, of course, if they can even play it, as access to the Twin Snakes is only for the financially ill-mannered or those who sail the digital high seas. In the end, what I am trying to convey to you is that the Twin Snakes does not degrade what Metal Gear is attempting to convey. It says so right on the box. How Metal Gear Solid is meant to be played. How could Kojima ever lie to me and say otherwise? It plays how one may imagine the game did when they were younger. Although they probably were younger, this game came out only 6 years after the original, and it is over 20 years old. Nostalgia is based strictly off vibe, and not how things actually were, just how it looks. The Twin Snakes conveys the emotions of characters better, plays better, has tonally consistent changes when it comes to the visual presentation, with the only major downside being that the first-person aiming kinda makes some parts of the game easier. Every change from the original game seems to have been given the grace by Kojima, which thus means that any negativity regarding it gives me the go-ahead to say that he is a man who has made mistakes, just as any mortal, thus giving me the even greater go-ahead to have intellectually inflammatory, but otherwise true comments on how Portable Ops is the worst mainline Metal Gear game.